Hi, welcome to Harlem Stories. This is Adam Feinberg. I am the creator and I am your podcast host. In Harlem Stories, we talk about Upper Manhattan and even inclusive of the northern portion of the Upper West Side, and we discuss issues that range from the people, the history, the architecture, the purchase and sale opportunities within these Upper Manhattan neighborhoods. And I also give you tips and tricks on buying and selling within these episodes. So today we are going to talk about understanding special assessments in a condo or co-op. And a lot of this comes from like local law 11 and local law 97, but it could come from other areas as well. Sometimes, like for instance, the building doesn't want to use its reserve, or maybe they don't have sufficient reserve to upgrade the lobby or add a roof deck, or this or that. That's not necessarily required, but things that owners want. So, but in New York City, I tend to say, for buyers, and owners alike, special assessments, they're a way of life in Manhattan. And ever since the Miami building collapse a few years ago, there's been an increased focus on these special assessments. To better understand what a special assessment is, I think we need to go back a bit and explain what's normally included in the routine expenses of ownership. So in a condo, your property taxes are broken out and billed separately. You also have common charges, which are billed monthly. The common charges should cover routine monthly expenses, such as paying for the building porter, the super, the elevator service contract, and testing for the elevator, the managing agent, and so on and so forth. We can go down all the line items, but if the building is smart, the common charges should also include an allocation for a reserve fund for long-term planning. The allocation for a reserve fund is sort of kind of a forced savings plan for the building. In a co-op, the monthly charge is called maintenance and should include the property taxes, those same routine monthly expenses I was talking about before, the porter, super, the elevator service contract, the managing agent, and so on and so forth. But that gives you an idea. But there could also be possibly a mortgage on the building structure. And the monthly maintenance charges should also include an allocation for a reserve fund as well. But it's optional, and but these days that's starting to get less optional because of changes in lending. So when a building is taken into consideration, if buyers should need to get a loan, and the building allows buyers to get a loan, well, that's certainly something that take into consideration because of that Miami building collapse. Banks are stricter about this. So whether we're talking about a condo or co-op, there's always the possibility of a special assessment. This is a charge over and above the routine monthly maintenance or common charges. And the natural question that comes out of this is, so why do we have special assessments? There are a number of reasons why the building might need to raise funds via a special assessment, including the monthly charges on routine expenses they're too low to cover the bills. Now, every building that runs into this problem either has monthly charges that are set way too low, or has expenses that need to be reviewed for potential savings. So this is a problem, as routine monthly charges need to be sufficient to cover routine monthly expenses. This usually occurs in buildings where the board members insist that low monthlies will add value to the apartments. So this is only true to the extent where that low monthlies are not causing other problems. This can also occur in well-established buildings where the board has not been actively monitoring income expenses. Now, I can tell you that first aspect of it held true in my own building, and that was certainly something that was really important to us. Is that I noticed that when I took over the board, the previous board members were insisting that low monthlies add value to the apartments, and that I can't argue that, except for the fact that the building has to be on solid financial ground for that to make sense. Our building was not. So, we had to raise common charges significantly, but we were having, unfortunately, special assessments to cover routine expenses, and that's not a sign of a healthy building. So that was one of the key things that I looked at when I took over the building, and it was a key consideration for me. I had a lot of pushback, I had a lot of people that hated me at the time, but I said, you're going to hate me until you love me, because ultimately, I'm going to, bring some predictability back to this equation. And we did it by raising common charges and having special assessments to start building for our capital needs, and that's what special assessments really should be for. So, the building has had recent capital improvements, but are not part of the routine monthly expenses. They now need to replenish these funds, and this happens quite a bit. Sometimes the monthly charges might include funds to help replenish their reserve account, but it might not be sufficient to restore the reserve account sufficiently in time for the next capital project. Some buildings would prefer to keep the monthlies as low as possible for as long as possible. Some buildings will look at special assessments from a tax perspective, when I'm talking about condos specifically, where a special assessment is held for capital improvements, which that might have a tax benefit of lowering the unit owner's tax basis when the apartment's sold. So that's one reason why some savvy building management teams might actually decide to hold special assessments rather than increase common charges. And this is actually somewhat common in Manhattan, and not surprising, considering that Manhattan is the financial capital of the world. So, of course, you're going to have some financially savvy people that are making some of these types of decisions. That said, it makes it for a little less predictability in terms of, trying to get your budget under control. But since the Miami building collapse, special assessments now take on a different importance than they did before. Banks are now scrutinizing the underlying financial and physical condition of buildings and might decline to underwrite mortgages if the building hasn't been properly maintained or have sufficient reserves. Now we have regulations in place that don't apply to other markets, so it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but we can get penalized with the agency lending underwriting standards because of these routine regulations that we have in place to minimize risk. So, for example, Local Law 11 facade inspections, nobody wants to worry about having a brick fall on their head. So that's, of course, why we have these Local Law 11 in place, is to maintain that facade. But you didn't have that in Miami. So, but banks are not taking that into consideration, that New York has been doing this for quite a while, and they keep making our building regulations even stricter. So, banks are not necessarily always taking that into consideration. Now, some could, but many have not been. So that Local Law 11 over there, the building could have done everything right to maintain the building properly, but the building had facade elements crack or break due to the New York winters. Like we have that winter freeze-thaw cycle, then lenders could penalize the building for not maintaining the building, even though the building has properly invested in maintenance as they should have. But this is where the importance of reserves come along, with having a plan in place to fix the problems in the building coming into play. So, then we get to the point over here of what can specifically trigger a special assessment. So there's any number of items that can trigger a special assessment. The most common items that we hear of right now: Local Law 11, facade maintenance, and other related items. When a qualified facade inspector reviews your building, which any building over 6 stories in Manhattan definitely has to, the inspector, they might identify items that go beyond simple facade maintenance, as it might be cheaper and easier to fix while you have the contractors and engineers on site, as well as the sidewalk shed and possibly scaffolding as needed. So while it's true it might be cheaper and easier to fix more than's required. Be careful of scope creep. And this is very common, whether you're in project management in an investment bank or whether you're, in building management over here. But, the building could wind up in a nonstop loop of always doing repairs without a break to owners' wallets, or the frustration of constant construction. So, that is certainly the concern about, always adding more projects to the scope of the project, of the original project. So sometimes you might have to do it, but other times you might be able to, and it might make more sense to postpone. So there's local law 97, which is more recent over here. Required energy efficiency upgrades and some of the fixes required could be in compliance. Some are relatively small items like change of hallway lighting to LED bulbs to, potentially something massive like upgrading an ancient boiler. What about roof replacement? I mean, that certainly comes into the equation. Elevator updates or upgrades, common area upgrades, or just simply firming up the reserves or even building a reserve where one didn't previously exist. Rare, but it happens. And then, you might get pushback from a lot of the owners, but at the same time, the building needs what it needs. And, the more you maintain it, the less it'll need in the long run, but the reality is a home always needs something. So, yeah, you're going to have all these different things that come up. So naturally, since you always are going to have things that pop up over here, just like owning a regular home, single family, the same holds true to condos and co-ops. But, at some point you have to pay for it. So some co-ops might make the decision to roll the extra cost into the building mortgage. And it'll increase that monthly maintenance, but it'll typically keep the cost to more manageable levels for owners by spreading the cost out over a longer period of time. So instead of having a $25,000 out-of-pocket assessment payable over 2 or 3 months, you might be able to spread it into a mortgage, and that $25,000 winds up becoming a little bit extra every month, but certainly not have to worry about stressing yourself out. So a lot of co-ops will make that decision, but some buildings will issue special assessments spread out over just a few months, which I mentioned before, while others might spread it out over years. So yes, you could spread it out via a mortgage, 30-year mortgage, or but you could also do it, whether it's just over a few months or maybe 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. Once you start spreading out longer, it's a lower monthly cost, but at the same time, resales are certainly going to question it, and it might wind up impacting the ability to get a deal done. So just one of those things that is, worth mentioning. But banks get concerned if that special assessment is too high. For example, above the monthly charges, but it could cause some owners to default. So this is something that boards need to be aware of that could cause banks not want to underwrite in these buildings, or at least until the building has moved forward in construction and has been successful collecting the special assessment on a timely basis for owners. So let's say if it's 2 years, a 2-year-long special assessment, and you're a full 1 year into it and you've now started construction, it's at that point that banks are much more likely to lend. But every situation is different and how they're handled. But I do know that banks, especially if it's a large special assessment, banks might have hesitation on these types of things. So these are all things to take into consideration in terms of an understanding like how this is all going to impact your wallet, and how buying and selling it might wind up impacting as well. I tend to say, beyond the banks having their own concerns, New York City has a long history of buildings that held special assessments, and sometimes they're within a few months, and but this was unusual in other places like Miami, and it's now becoming far more common, and that's also making Miami, along with other rule changes that they've had, due to hurricanes, but also because of that building collapse in Surfside. So it's also making Miami now come into kind of fairer comparison for Manhattan. It's also making Manhattan probably more popular as a result, because we were losing out a lot of buyers to Miami for a long time. But now that those costs have skyrocketed in Miami now, I expect we'll be seeing a very different situation going forward. But if the building doesn't have adequate reserves, I do recommend to my buyer clients that they set a bit extra aside every month with the expectation that some large capital project will come along at some point, and often it'll come with little or no advance notice. And that payment period, again, we discussed this, but it could be just a few months, or for And it could be a massive, like 5-figure, 6-figure special assessment, depending on the building, depending on the situation. So it's better to be prepared. But if the building does budget every month for a reserve, it should be at least a 10% contribution toward the reserve account. I would tend to recommend 11 or 12%, but because sometimes the amount can exceed what the building has set aside. Well, again, I wanted my buyers to be aware of, understanding special assessments, how it might impact them on a living basis, but also on the purchase and sale process as well. So these are really important aspects to understand as we move forward. But thank you again for joining me at Harlem Stories, and we are always looking to enjoy, but entertaining you, but also educating you. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.